How are suspects interviewed? And how can we reduce the rate of false confessions? Table 12.2 from the textbook summarizes the steps of interrogation. First, the suspect is confronted with accusations that they committed a crime. Then, the interrogator develops themes that appear to justify or excuse the crime, in hopes of encouraging the suspect to confess. They also interrupt the suspect when they assert their innocence, deny any involvement, or object to the charges. If a suspect tries to tune them out, they keep them awake and engaged, trying to drain their energy. Some interrogations can last days, although this practice is slowly being phased out of use in the U.S. Throughout the process, the interrogator shows sympathy for the suspect and urges them to confess to cope with their guilt. They usually offer a face-saving explanation for the crime, again, to encourage them to confess. They ask plenty of questions to get the suspect talking about the crime, waiting for them to slip up and share too many details. And finally, when they secure a verbal confession, they convince the suspect to put it in writing and sign it. Sometimes this last step is used to give tired suspects a way to give up and make the interrogation stop. Unfortunately, these tactics are not as effective as one might think. The major problem with them is that they increase the likelihood of false confessions and wrongful convictions. Furthermore, jurors are powerfully influenced by confessions, even if they know it was coerced. It's also important to note that people are not good lie detectors, a topic you learned about in a previous lecture. Most of the verbal and nonverbal cues that we are told to pay attention to don't help us discriminate between truth and lies. On average, laypeople like us are only accurate 54% of the time, and training produces little, if any, improvement. Police officers, judges, psychiatrists, customs inspectors, and other professionals tend to perform only slightly better, if at all. Yet, we rely on these people to make judgments about whether suspects are telling the truth. Sometimes interrogations involve the use of polygraph tests. A polygraph is a mechanical instrument that records physiological arousal from multiple channels. As shown in the image on the slide, rubber tubes are strapped around the torso to measure breathing. A blood pressure cuff is wrapped around the upper arm to measure the pulse rate. And electrodes are placed on the fingertips to record perspiration. The test administrator asks the suspect yes-no control questions, like, "Have you ever lied before?" to establish a baseline. Then, they ask questions related to the crime, like, "Did you murder your spouse?" Then, they read the results to infer whether the suspect is telling the truth. In theory, people who are innocent should be more aroused by control questions, while people who are guilty should be more physiologically aroused by crime-relevant questions. The research, however, suggests that polygraphs can be faked by guilty people if they inflate their arousal to control questions and mask their arousal to the questions about the crime. These tests can also incriminate innocent people, creating a serious problem for any criminal justice system that relies on them. For this reason, they have limited applicability and are often used to eliminate suspects, rather than used to prove that someone who fails the test is, in fact, the guilty party. As you can see, false confessions are a major problem for the criminal justice system in the U.S. In 2011, Garrett and colleagues examined a sample of wrongful convictions proved by DNA evidence, and they found that false confessions were present in 25% of all the wrongful convictions they studied. You may be wondering why an innocent person might confess to a crime they didn't commit. There are two main reasons. One, due to compliance pressures, to escape a very stressful situation. In the moment, the short-term benefits of confessing and escaping a stressful interrogation can outweigh the long-term benefits of denial and continuing the interrogation. Some people do not fully consider the future consequences of falsely confessing. They incorrectly assume that they can prove their innocence later, which may be possible, but will be more difficult after they sign a false confession. 2. Due to internalization of guilt. That's right. Some people come to believe through the interrogation process that they must have committed the crime. Social psychologists have identified some of the risk factors involved in making false confessions. They are more likely when the suspect lacks a clear memory of the event in question. The suspect may have been under the influence of drugs or alcohol, for instance. False confessions are also more likely when interrogators present false evidence, when they make repeated offers of leniency in exchange for cooperation, and when they minimize the seriousness of the crime. On the final slides of this section, let's explore some of the strategies we can use to reduce the rate of false confessions. First, we need better lie detectors. Researchers have experimented with different types of questions, measuring involuntary brain activity and pupil dilation, using implicit association tests, measuring blood oxygen levels with functional MRIs, and measuring skin temperature with thermal imaging cameras. Second, social psychologists recommend educating the legal community, especially jurors, about interrogation techniques and false confessions. Third, some experts suggest that we outlaw coercive interrogation altogether, such as physically painful tactics, the deprivation of basic needs like food and sleep, and the presentation of false evidence. And fourth, record interrogations. This enables judges and juries to see for themselves how a confession came about and the extent to which the suspect was coerced. If a suspect is thought to be guilty of the crime after the interrogation process, the case may end up in a courtroom before a jury of the suspect's peers. In the next part of this lecture, we'll learn more about how juries are selected.